his date with death. By Clinton Dangerfield, author of That Legal Crime. Detective Story Magazine, June 1930. There was no room in him for hate or malice. Shelter, temporary safety, and fire Claiborne had, but no food. He faced the grim necessity of going down into the plain to seek supplies, at the risk which it involved. He drank again from the spring near him, tightened his belt an inch more, made his way down the mountain, and thence into the foothills, 6 feet of lithe, young manhood, a lonely but gallant figure, firm-lipped, the gray eyes steady and piercing. The sun was now near setting. The friendly shades of night would, he hoped, enable him to secure needed food from some prosperous kitchen. He pushed on, keeping what cover he could find, for although he had secured a suit of ordinary clothing, he was a marked man. Over him hung the sword of the state's price on his head, for this day had been appointed as Claiborne's date with death. He had broken jail last week, through unprecedented courage and ingenuity. He had good hopes of making a seaport and starting life again where he'd be unknown. Hope is uncrushable at 22. He moved on, watching the road which he paralleled, but dared not follow, listening with strained ears for the slightest sound of men. To him they were no longer men, but a wolf pack trailing him. Yet it wasn't a man that halted him. It was the sudden sight of a roadside placard nailed to a white oak. Nothing about the reward, but showing in sprawling handwriting a message at which the fugitive stared in mingled astonishment and fury. Absorbed in the paragraph written there, he did not hear the approach of 2 horsemen until they were almost on him. But he was so swift and so silent in rushing back to his cover in the green Kentucky copse that he gained a hiding place in time. The riders halted at the writing and read it in evident astonishment. One of them frowned as he exclaimed, "I don't see why Claiborne should poke his neck any further into the noose by carrying off Lucy Whitwire." "Must be plumb off his head about her," returned the other. "Darn pretty, ain't she, Tapsalter?" "Lucy Whitwire," said the first speaker, a heavy-set, middle-aged man, "is lovely in an unusual sort of way. Her hair's the palest gold. Her skin's translucent with just a faint wash of rose on the cheeks. Her eyes are blue, but it's so pale a blue that it's just a pastel color, barely blue at all, and yet the eyes are beautiful and fringed round with great long, soft lashes. She has a very pretty humility in the way she drops her lids. Flatters a man. Her mouth's that Cupid's bow business. Her hands are small and sort of fluttery, like little butterflies. She's a peg to hang dreams on." The other stared. "You always talk queerly, Tapsalter," he said. Then as Tapsalter gathered up his reins, "Wait till I fix this stirrup leather. Wasn't this Shelton Claiborne engaged to Kate Seymour?" "Yes," growled Tapsalter, "and she'd have stood by him through thick and thin. But Lucy Whitwire, engaged to Claiborne, broke her engagement with the first hint of suspicion that he was a murderer. She never even waited for the decision in court. Of course, her father had been against it from the first, and Lucy never would have been engaged to this fellow Shelton Claiborne. If it hadn't been that Claiborne owned as strong a will in his way as Whitwire did in his. Their wills balanced about even for Lucy. But with love in the balance, the scales went down on Claiborne's side. On the other hand, remarked the other, when he was arrested, the scales went down on her dad's side, didn't they?" "Yes," said Tapsalter. "She wrote Shelton Claiborne a sweet little note saying that she knew of course he wouldn't want her dragged into anything like that. You might say that Shelton Claiborne was lucky to get free of her." "How could he be lucky about anything when he's a hunted fugitive up in the hills? A man who should have been hung today and only cheated the gallows by a margin so narrow it was something like a miracle. The devil with this leather, it's plumb rotten." "You ride steady with strain too short on the stirrup strap," said Tapsalter. "Claiborne's like me, A long stirrup rider. I hope he gets through to a seaport." "Then he'd better not fool around with Lucy Whitwire," retorted his companion, and the two rode on together, leaving the man and the cops mutely staring after them. Lucy Whitwire. Yes, they had described her rightly. She was a feather, and no more, whirled on the wind of other people's wills, and in order to win Lucy's moonlight and lily loveliness, he had turned away like a fool from the less ethereal beauty of Kate Seymour. Kate of the steadfast eyes and of a constancy so great that when the storm rose against Shelton Claiborne, it was she who had visited him and had tried to console him. Neither girl could ever be his now. He no longer desired Lucy. He recalled with amazement his infatuation for her, and any hope of life with Kate would have been too fantastic to contemplate. For he was a hunted fugitive who had barely escaped the noose for the present, and might yet be taken in its hideous circle. He stared again at the written placard. Lucy, carried off. This thing had happened to her. There was at least one man whom she had wrought to a desperation ready to take any chance, Jim Brocklehurst, a cruel savage, suspected of crimes which might land him in jail for the rest of his life. Fox Clever, for he had forged Claiborne's handwriting, had loaded on Claiborne all suspicion. Lucy, what better did she deserve? The dream was ashes. Let her go. Madness to think of her. Madness to waste pity on her merely because she had once been the peg on which to hang his dreams. What if chance had given him, Shelton Claiborne, knowledge of? Hang it all, he must get about his business of obtaining supplies. This was life, to be caught in the clutch of circumstance, to be broken on the wheel of accident. Let her take her share of it. As the shades of night darkened around Shelton Claiborne in his search for food, lights began to appear here and there in the fine mansion of John Whitwire, prosperous Kentucky tobacconist and influential citizen. Gas and electric lights hadn't come in yet. Yellow kerosene lamps were the source of illumination. One of the largest of these blazed out from John Whitwire's private den. A match had been put to it by Whitwire's crony, Peter Tapsalter, who had just arrived and was waiting for his friend to come in. Tapsalter was a man who took life easily. He sat there smoking placidly but listening keenly. Now he heard on the driveway below the drumming rhythm of a horse approaching at a hand gallop, and in a few moments John Whitwire strode in, haggard and dusty. He closed the door behind him. Tapsalter did not rise. He only said very quietly, "Got your wire and came at once. I hear you've been in the saddle day and night hunting her. No luck at all?" Whitwire flung himself into a chair. He sat erect even in his grief, a finely chiseled, impressive-looking man, piercing-eyed, with a gaze as hard as a hawk's. His words filtered through his closed teeth, biting down on his rage and despair as he answered, "No luck at all. She's gone. That devil Claiborne has found a way to knife me in the back. I'll never see Lucy again. Look here." Tapsalter took the paper, glanced at it, and returned it to Whitwire, saying slowly, "Yes, I saw one just like it on my way here. It's evidently been posted in duplicate." "Are you sure that's Claiborne's handwriting?" "Of course I'm sure. I've seen his signature many a time on his letters to Lucy, but if the placard were printed it would still be genuine, for Claiborne would have dictated it." Whitwire sprang up as he spoke. He walked about in great agitation. "Lord," he said thickly, "my Lucy at the mercy of a man who escaped with the noose almost around his neck." Tapsalter said slowly, "Yes, he'd have been hung all right if he hadn't escaped. Even the pardoning governor wouldn't pardon him. And yet somehow I never could quite figure that. So many people think Claiborne innocent, he." But Whitwire interrupted him passionately. "Shelton Claiborne's son, Claiborne, the second, worse than even his father was." "Whitwire," Tapsalter said, frowning, "you never were quite normal on the subject of the Claibornes. You've got a hate hangover that's worse than any whiskey hangover I ever saw. Lots of people believe this Shelton Claiborne to be innocent, but you only see in him an enemy's son. You only see in him the breed of a man who took Ellen Bracebridge away from you and married her. Because of this fugitive's mother, you aren't quite normal where these Claibornes are concerned." Whitwire whipped fiercely around on him. "Is this any time to be preaching to me?" Tapsalter thrust his hands into his pockets. "Don't be an idiot," he said. "I'm not preaching. I'm trying to make you feel that your girl Lucy could be in worse hands than Shelton Claiborne's." Whitwire cried out, his fingers balling into fists. "How could the whole thing be worse? This is the day on which Shelton Claiborne was due to be hung. Instead of that, he's up in these inaccessible nightmare mountains somewhere with my girl. Tapsalter, do something, can't you? For heaven's sake, is there nothing you can think of? I'll go and wire for a brace of dogs I heard of yesterday. Maybe they can pick up the scent. Until then," he snapped off the sentence, and both men whirled at the sound of a low but dominant voice from the door. "Reach, gentlemen." Their hands went up, for there at the closed door stood the man who had a date with death, Shelton Claiborne. Their hands had gone up instinctively. But now they saw that Shelton Claiborne's hands were empty. His voice, as low but as dominant as before, broke a trifle mockingly on their ears. "I merely wanted to keep your hands in the air long enough to let you get used to my presence, gentlemen. I have no gun." Whitwire's revolver leaped out. Shelton Claiborne smiled a little contemptuously. "I wouldn't bother with that sort of thing," he said. "You can kill me any time you like. An unarmed man is no danger to you. But let us talk first. I came here about Lucy. I didn't write that note. That was posted by the man who really got your daughter and fixed the blame on me. A pretty shrewd trick, chalking it up to the revenge motive that I might have against you, because you have never been my friend and have always opposed my engagement to Lucy." His eager glance went directly to Tapsalter. "You, Mr. Tapsalter," he continued, "discussed this matter with a friend of yours when you passed the placard posted near a thick copse. I was there, listening. I'd already seen that placard, and I wish I'd never seen it, for I've had a devil of a fight with myself. On the one side I already had safety, and on the other there was Lucy in the hands of this man." "In the hands of what man?" Tapsalter demanded sharply. Whitwire seemed beyond speech. His gun hand had fallen to his side, and he was listening in a confused astonishment. "What man?" repeated Tapsalter insistently. "The man," answered Shelton Claiborne, "who has always been suspected through this whole county of illegal practices, even suspected of counterfeiting. And yet nothing has ever been proved against him. Do you know who I mean?" "Jim Brocklehurst," exclaimed Tapsalter. "And you claim he forged this message in your handwriting?" "Tapsalter, if it were not so, would I be here?" Tapsalter cursed. Claiborne's gaze flashed to Whitwire. "Don't misunderstand me, John Whitwire," he said. "I haven't come to you for the love that I feel for Lucy now. I've ceased to love her. But I can never forget all she stirred in me when we were engaged. A man's first dream of love is never forgotten. For the sake of that dream, I've risked everything to come here, because this was the one place in which a man, Lucy's father, would be driven by love of her to trust me with horses and guns and help, secret help." Whitwire was dumb. The fugitive rushed on. "I want you, Whitwire, and I want you, Tapsalter. But first of all, I want food and drink, and then the three of us will take her tonight, from the hands of Jim Brocklehurst. I know where he's got her hidden. There's only one place where he could put through a thing like this. He has an ally up there in the hills. Lucy'll be forced into marriage there tonight. Brocklehurst won't find that hard. Whatever the strongest mind nearest her wills, she does. But maybe we'll get there in time, Whitwire, to give her back into your hands. Still Lucy Whitwire." Whitwire gasped. Every word that this fugitive spoke was weighted with truth. Haggard from lack of food, scratched with briars, dusty with crawling on his hands and knees through bushes where he must have covered, unarmed and condemned, Shelton Claiborne held in the hollow of his hand the two men listening to him. Claiborne continued sharply, "You, Tapsalter, go down to the kitchen and fetch for us here coffee and food. Lock the door after you when you go out, so that no one can get in here." "But hurry," Tapsalter went. He sped to the kitchen, and in his going he muttered to himself jumbled sentences and strange oaths. An hour later, 3 men were far into the foothills that preface the mountains rising in grim majesty above them. They were headed for a woods road which twisted up into those heights, where the law lost interest and did not try to penetrate. They rode 3 blooded Kentucky horses, and they were about to rise into realms where nature still claims her own and bars out with jutting boulders and closed forests the intrusions of civilization. A strange forest country of good and ill, in which the good predominates and yet suffers with indifference the existence of crime, holding that each man's home is his own castle and therein he may do what he pleases. So long as he does not intrude upon the castle of his neighbor, he is safe. Those 3 riders, the impeccable citizen John Whitwire, his respected friend Tapsalter, and the fugitive who had that day a date with the noose, had not yet gained the woods road when they heard the bang and rattle of a steel-tired buckboard, the rapid trot of harnessed horses. Shelton Claiborne spurred his horse into the darkening safety of a little ravine hidden from the roadway by a thick screen of brush. Yet when the buckboard halted before the other 2 riders, the fugitive was not a yard away from the sheriff of the county, who snarled out, "Who's there?" And then, "Oh, it's you, Mr. Whitwire and Mr. Tapsalter?" The sheriff's tone changed into respect and sympathy. "I suppose you're on the same errand as myself, hunting that escaped murderer, Shelton Claiborne. He's put the cap on the climax by abducting your girl. I never heard of such gall in a criminal. Have you any clue?" "No," said Whitwire, "no clue." His tone was monotonous. He felt strangely shaken. A sudden doubt had come over him about Shelton Claiborne. Perhaps Lucy was already this fugitive's wife, and he himself was being trapped into the mountains to be murdered. 1,000 grim suggestions darted through his mind, and for a second he was torn by conflicting distrust and suspicion. Then the sheriff said, "I've had a tip, Mr. Whitwire, a sure tip. Claiborne's headed for the junction. He's aiming to swing a freight there, and I'm aiming to be there in time. You can come with me if you like and leave the horses, or you can turn back and ride at your leisure. Ain't no use in your going on here." "Thanks," said Whitwire in the same blank voice. "I'll turn back and ride at my leisure. I hope you get him, Sheriff." "I hope I do," said the sheriff. "I never heard of such a thing. Gallows food like him going off with a girl like your Lucy." So long. The buckboard was gone. The condemned man rode out from the little ravine. The 3 resumed their journey. In 100 yards, they turned into the woods road, which was overgrown with bushes. The road was still used occasionally, but the forest dwellers who used it drove their heavy wagons over the brush and weeds. Higher the riders rose and higher. The moon climbed with them as they went, and the thoughts of Whitwire were like the night, patches of white and patches of black. For black hate of Claiborne rode in Whitwire's heart, and white hope that he might still save his Lucy, his idolized daughter. Another hour passed, and suddenly Claiborne checked them. "Listen," he exclaimed. "I hear a man singing, and you can tell by the way the sound shifts that he's patrolling a cliff under the house in which we'll find Lucy. Since there are sentinels out, the wedding must be going on now." "Kill him," Whitwire said in a low, hoarse, and murderous tone. "He'll give the alarm and we'll lose everything. Kill him." "No," Claiborne retorted. "Life is as sweet to him as to you and me. I'll get him in a way that won't do him any great harm. "You stay here with the horses." He tossed his own reins to Whitwire and disappeared into the underbrush, making a steady and extraordinarily noiseless way toward the sentinel. Claiborne came out on the ledge just above his man. But the fellow by that time had ridden up the road a little way. There he halted, yawned, seemed half-mind to go farther still. Then he turned his horse, grumbling aloud to the night, cursing his luck that he had been set upon this solitary job when, up at the outlaw den above, feasting and drinking were going on. Nothing is so bad that it can't be worse. Freedom of movement and a cigarette the sentinel had. But now, in the midst of his cursing complaints, there suddenly descended upon his shoulders, dropping like a cougar from the overhang, something which tore him with irresistible strength from his horse, pulling him down to the ground and sending the terrified animal galloping wildly off into the night. But the surprised sentinel did not succumb tamely. He was a big man and a powerful one. Moreover, as the two pitched to the ground together, a writhing heave of the outlaw's body had brought him on top. The destinies of that night trembled in the balance as the two men were molded together in a composite form of fighting fury. They rolled and surged there, riding the tale of their struggle on crushed scrub and loosened soil. Then suddenly one figure arose, partly, still kneeling on the chest of the other, keeping the man under him down by iron fingers locked around his throat. Claiborne whistled. Whitwire and Tapsalter came at a gallop. 3 minutes later, the sentinel was looking back on his former occupation as something he had totally failed to appreciate, for instead of being able to shift up and down the road as he pleased, he was securely bound. A stick with a handkerchief wrapped around it had been fastened in his mouth by the simple device of knotting another handkerchief on the stick and then passing the cloth around his head. Unable to yell, unable to move, except with the most painful floundering, he heard the hoofbeats of 3 horses die rapidly away. His horse had been caught and tied where it could carry no alarming tidings. A few yards more, and Claiborne said coldly they must leave the horses and go up the zigzag path, which would bring them out near a part of the house little likely to be used, since the scaling of the cliff on that side was no easy matter. "I'll lead the way," he said. "You follow." "But Lucy," protested Whitwire, "we can never bring her down those rocks." "No," said Claiborne tersely. "We'll bring her around the safer way. We can afford to do that then, for the whole place will be in confusion. And Tapsalter," he added, "can take the horses around to where the safe road comes down. Just follow this dry creek bed, Tapsalter, and you'll come to it about 2 miles down." Tapsalter nodded, and in another moment was moving off on his own mount, leading the other horses. Facing the cliff which was to be scaled, Whitwire groaned aloud. "Oh, we can never make it." "Cut that," said Claiborne impatiently. "Thoughts like those are a chain drag on a man's hands and feet. We shall make it. Say that to yourself." "Claiborne," began Whitwire hoarsely. The other man flashed round on him and said curtly, "What? Don't burn up our time here for nothing. Don't just stand there and talk." "No," said Whitwire. "No, you're right. Let's go on." Claiborne led the way. There was a cool confidence in his movements, a reassurance in his steady voice that occasionally called softly down to the older man behind him. It enabled Whitwire to do the thing he had always feared: swarm up the face of a broken cliff where a false footing or the loosening of a shrub in some cranny might mean pitching down to the earth below. Whitwire had almost a phobia against this kind of thing, and cold perspiration sprang out in beads on his face as he toiled upward, the dewy damp of terror. It seemed to Whitwire a century before he finally saw the man ahead of him vanish over the top of a sort of shelf, and then beheld the hand of Claiborne reach down to assist him. He grasped it eagerly, and now they both stood on top together. Jim Brocklehurst, a study in red, stood before the half-drunken justice of the peace whom he had purveyed for this occasion. Red was Brocklehurst's hair, and nearly as red his large, coarse face, which yet had a certain handsomeness in its shaping. Red-brown were his eyes, fierce and compelling. Reddish-tan were his big hands hanging by his side, hairy and spatulate hands. There were scarlet flashes in the tie that he wore to enhance his personal appearance on this occasion. It went well, he thought, that tie with his blue suit. He smiled at the justice, and the smile showed a row of big white teeth, flawless and glistening. Beside him stood the girl whom he had coerced into this marriage, exactly as Shelton Claiborne had foreseen. This lovely feather tossed on the current of men's wills had not the personality to save herself from any man's persistence. She was of the kind that, in great cities, go down into the dregs of life, the kind that a higher class saves by incessant watchfulness and chaperoning. Yet, after her fashion, she felt rage and despair over her situation. She realized that the dominant and mesmeric will of the man beside her was too strong to fight, and yet she said to herself that he was coarse, common, horrible. If she did not have courage, she had taste. And in her pale way she hated him as they stood there, and hated the wedding guests behind her, nearly a dozen lawless men. Some of them were counterfeiters, several others were thieves who preyed on the cattle and stock in the valley below at scattered intervals, and still others were men who had taken refuge up here, either from the law or from the personal vengeance of some of their own kin. This gathering constituted the element which the better class of the forest dwellers left strictly alone. The wedding guests were all in a good humor, from Parson, the knife-thrower, to Upweather, the giant, who was the crack-shot of the assemblage. Theoretically, they should all have laid aside their weapons for this occasion, but they were men whose weapons were part of them, as much so as their hands or their feet. They were still armed, though in liquor the justice, renegade as he was, felt uneasy. He said, "Jim, you sure this is all okay?" "Lucy," commanded Brocklehurst's compelling voice, "tell him you want to marry me." She struggled to utter a denial, but his fierce clutch was on her wrist. She felt the red fire of his eyes plunging in electric, positive waves through her negative mind. Acquiescence was torn out of her instead of denial. "I want," she faltered, and the justice could scarcely catch her faint tone, "to mar." The word broke in its inception, and she stiffened inside the arm which Brocklehurst passed around her. Flashing a quick look at her, he saw that her features had changed. Her eyes were dilated, her mouth slowly opening as though the lips parted for a scream. While his eyes were on her face, Brocklehurst heard behind him a rush of sound, the blended confusion of curses involuntarily reeking out from half a dozen throats. With cat-like quickness, his head turned over his left shoulder in hurried surprise. But he stared into the gaping faces of his guests, who weren't looking at him but at something beyond. Brocklehurst whipped back and saw that he, the justice, his men, were all under cover of 2 guns, in the steady hands of the man whose name he had used in abducting Lucy Whitwire. For a moment he thought that his own vision had deceived him. The feeling was so strong that he exclaimed, "Claiborne, you! It can't be!" As the words left his lips, Lucy, galvanized into action by a pair of eyes which were not Claiborne's, darted from under the arms of her bridegroom, rushed to the left, and sprang into the eager clasp of her father. Whitwire snatched her up. He flung round and disappeared through the back exit, obeying Claiborne's orders, already given. He went with a swift celerity of movement that made Brocklehurst feel that he himself might have had a drink too much. But his jaws clenched on the cold reality, for Claiborne's voice rang through the room. "Reach every man of you." Every hand went high, but one man in the group brought something in his hand as it rose. Parson, the knife-thrower. His glittering blade flashed through the air, missed Claiborne's bare head by the merest fraction, and buried itself in the wall beyond, where it stuck, quivering and humming. Shelton Claiborne laughed. "A man only has so much bad luck," he said. "Measured out for him. Outside of that, you can't hurt him. I saw who threw that. What if I picked you off, friend, in return for that little compliment?" No, I was rattled. I didn't aim." "Well," Claiborne interrupted, his eyes flashing back to Brocklehurst's red face, "throwing a knife in the face of a gun is at least a man's act. It sets a man a lot sight higher than the fellow who forges my name to cover kidnapping a girl." "You're a cur, Brocklehurst, and you're a fool that don't know enough to keep his neck out of the rope," retorted Brocklehurst, who in no way lacked for courage, although, like the others, his hands had gone above his head. "What I did showed some brains. What you've done here tonight, saving from her own squeamishness a girl who never cared enough for you to stand by you when you were in trouble, shows that you're just plain loco, Claiborne, and you'll never get away from this house alive. You've got the drop on us now, but you can't keep it on everyone all the time." "Not get away from here alive," said Claiborne, and there was a sudden chill laughter in his voice. "Well, let's see, Brocklehurst, what sort of a prophet you are." As he spoke, Shelton Claiborne fired. The big kerosene chandelier dropped to the roar of his gun. The room was plunged in darkness and became instantly a maelstrom of confusion and oaths. Brocklehurst reached the back door almost as soon as Claiborne did. But his activity was unhealthful for his well-being, for, as he reached for the doorknob, the fist of Shelton Claiborne caught him in a driving blow which dropped him unconscious to the floor. In the next second, Claiborne was through the door, had turned the key on the outside, and was gone. Past star after star, the silvery moon climbed in cold beauty. Now and then a cloud drifted across her face, and invisible fingers seemed to tear it aside again. When she began to sink toward the western horizon, almost into the arms of the coming day, Lucy herself was sound asleep in her pretty bedroom. While she slept, safely and luxuriously, 3 figures rose from a table at which they had eaten and drunk in secret. As they rose and went to the fireplace, each dropping into a chair, Whitwire said slowly, offering cigarettes to his guests, "Claiborne, I've been counted a sane, level-headed man, but in that ride from Brocklehurst's den there in the cold moonlight, with my girl behind me and you at my side, I think I realized at last what letting an idea run away with you means. I've been a one-idea man, Claiborne, and I just about believe that a fellow who's that can't be balanced. I've made money and I have influence. I can be diplomatic and I can be kind. But all those things in my life have been subsidiary to the one big idea. You know what I mean, that idea?" Claiborne shook his head, but the listening Tapsalter nodded slightly. "Hate," said Whitwire. "It began with your father, Claiborne. Your father was a bad man clear through." "Admitted," said Claiborne coolly. "He was a bad man clear through, and so was your own dad. Both of us sprang from the loins of men without scruples, hard as steel and mean as lynxes. But no man's mind is a replica of his father's." "Reasonable," said Whitwire slowly. "Reasonable and right. But to me, you were the reincarnation of my enemy. You can't imagine, Claiborne, what a replica of him you are. You've got his gestures, his eyes, his tone, and I said to myself that you were just a piece split off from his soul as far as your mind went. And when I found that you loved my girl, I came near killing you. I had brooded so long. Your father was dead, in a sense, yes, underground. But here he was again in another form. In the first form, he had taken the girl I loved and wanted to marry. In the second form, he was about to take the girl I loved because she was my child, bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. I suppose you can't understand, Claiborne. I suppose you, although you are your father's son, have never hated. Answer me, do you know what hate means?" "I know what fury means," said Claiborne grimly, "and I know what despair means. But in the sense in which you describe hate becoming the chief thread in your whole life, I know nothing of such a thing as that. It seems to me that sort of hate is something that hurts the hater worse than the hated." "Don't be too sure about that," Whitwire returned with equal grimness. "If I had not hated you as I did, you would have been a free man now. You would never have been condemned. You would never even have been arrested." Tapsalter uttered an inarticulate exclamation. Claiborne started up. "What?" "Sit down," said Whitwire. "Sit down and let me finish while I'm still under the influence of what you've done tonight." Claiborne dropped back into his chair. Whitwire went on. "I had in my hand evidence which was brought to me by a man who was killed the next day in an automobile accident. That evidence would have cleared you and will still clear you." "Clear me?" gasped Claiborne. "You mean that?" "Yes." "Don't interrupt me. You may break the spell yet in which I see myself as I have been. Before or after you were condemned, I could have saved you. Worse yet, I am a friend, a close and intimate friend of the governor. He was about to pardon you, but he thinks a lot of my opinion. I turned him at the last minute. I tightened the noose around your neck. So far as I am concerned, in intent, I killed you." As he spoke, Whitwire rose, walked to his safe, opened it, came back again, and threw on the table beside Shelton Claiborne a packet. Tapsalter, staring, remained silent. "There is your evidence," said Whitwire. "I shall go with it to the governor, and I'll tell him in the morning the same tale I have told you and Tapsalter here tonight. I'll hide you here until you're pardoned. You will have to incur the ignominy of a pardon when you are, as I know, guiltless. Yes, the governor will pardon you, Claiborne. But you, who out of your generosity have turned a searchlight on my own soul, you who have acquired freedom by being too big for my hate to crush, you will never be big enough to pardon me." Silence fell in the room. Claiborne was struggling with the emotion of a joy so tremendous, so wildly stirring, that it might almost be said to have repaid him for all that he had gone through. He knew now what most of us can never know, the halcyon joy of restoration. And for a little while in that silence, there was in his mind a gladness so great that when he rose and walked to one of the windows, he staggered slightly, drunk with the wine of unexpected freedom. Then, from the recesses of his soul, from those depths where live in all of us hates and jealousies, there flared up inside of him a red fire of fury before which his joy receded. How unnecessary, how cruel, how unspeakably vicious, low and mean, how hideous beyond words had been the injury done him. His hand grasped the window-sill and closed on it till the knuckles whitened. But this mood also passed. That in his soul which enabled him to save Lucy now enabled him to save himself from becoming, in his turn, what the humiliated and repentant man near him had been all his life, an embittered hater. The fire of desired revenge died in Shelton Claiborne. He turned toward Whitwire and said simply, "I do understand what you have been, Whitwire. You weren't normal. Perhaps from now on you will be. When you have done what you will do, clear me and set me free. If we cannot part friends, we can at least part as those who bear no malice toward each other." Whitwire's glance fell. He said humbly, "I hadn't deserved so much." Shelton Claiborne glanced toward the east. Morning was deepening into day, a new day of freedom, of justification. Reflected in the rosy sunrise colors still tinting the sky, he saw no longer the moonlight loveliness of Lucy, but the glowing, steadfast eyes of Kate Seymour. End of His Date with Death by Clinton Dangerfield.